Good morning, all of my saints from Wadesboro and all my free-range followers of Jesus joining us this morning. Happy Sunday. It's a great day to be in the house of the Lord, even if virtually, as we've been learning in this season of the great pause, how to worship in place. It's a great time to be a Jesus follower, because everything we do in the name of the Lord, that is in the loving, kind vein, or is the Hebrew word chesed, is loving God's loving kindness. It sets us on as a light in the darkness. It makes us stand out as countercultural. Last week, as we began our journey with Jesus up to the mountains of Caesarea Philippi, on his camping trip with his PJs, and they were sitting around the campfire, and he asked them that what could have just remained a philosophical question about who do people say that I am, but then turned the discussion to the most poignant, silence-breaking moment when he asked them to respond personally, who do you say that I am? And last week we gave some choices, some enumeration of what people were saying Jesus was about. Prophet, naming Elijah and Jeremiah specifically, or John the Baptist raised from the dead. And we talked about how it's often around a campfire, by a fishing hole, sometimes in a car, or just sitting on the porch rocking, when some of the most incredible conversations about ultimate spiritual values and experiences seem to take place. Many years ago, I was working with farmers across the United States during the height of the farm crisis in the mid-'80s. I started a rural church down in Hampton, South Carolina, and actually had 4 small churches, and I drove a Volkswagen Rabbit diesel pickup truck. And I would have 3 services every morning, and I'd get in my truck and I'd go, and I'd have the first service at 9 o'clock, the second service at 10:10, the third service at 11:15. And often it was the organist who knew I was on time or about to arrive, because they could hear me gearing down with my diesel pickup truck coming around the curve flying. But it was in that experience in the farming community, among other communities in which I served, that I realized that many times we paint stained glass portraits of who Jesus is, or we serve up platitudes in the time of pain. How many of us have stood in funeral lines and heard platitudes, well meant, sincere, but ultimately statements that would fall flat to bring any comfort when somebody says, well, call me if you need something. God needed another angel. God doesn't make mistakes. And in the midst of those moments, we're not able to receive what may be the intent of the person who's given it to us. But all we hear is the words. And I think in times of crisis, times of stress, times of conflict, platitudes simply will not do enough. And simply trying to paint a picture of Jesus meek and mild is not one that rings true historically, but also rings flat for an inspiration of, is that somebody I want to give my life to? And is that someone I want to really follow, even when things are very hard? In the height of the farm crisis, there were people who were losing their farms. They were in whole herd buyouts. I stood with many of my members as they were doing the farm auctions, auctioning off pieces of equipment that they helped build, helped to buy, whole herds that they'd milked for generations, and knew their names and lineages, the lineage and heritage of the sires, and where each calf and each one had come. On one particular occasion, I remember talking to a gentleman who had just lost everything, but because of his depression and the confusion that was part of his life, while we were even speaking, picked up the phone and called the International Harvester store, ordering a whole new set of disc arrows. It made no sense. It made no sense. Some of my members, they had accidents in the field, and some of those accidents proved to be fatal. In one of the trips that I took in that season, it was to Washington, D.C. to be part of a national group that were struggling with rural families and what was happening to rural churches and rural communities and the mental health needs and spiritual needs. And I was invited along as a young pastor with some of my church members. And I'll never forget one night, we were after dinner and all the meetings had broken up. I was walking with a man named Jim from Kansas, and he'd been part of a family farm since it started it. The land became open to his family. But now he was confused, and he'd lost the family farm. He was working with a group trying to work on helping farm families to navigate the new world. His second, I believe it was his third marriage was crumbling. And we found ourselves walking through the National Mall in Washington late in the evening, and we ended up sitting on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Not many people around, but we sat there, and Jim began to talk about how his life was falling apart. He'd come from a strong family of great values and church folks, and he was now feeling disillusioned because of what he saw melting and eroding around him that always had been pillars of his life. The family farm, the community of friends and neighbors that had to sell off and move, the loss of his identity as one who was going to take on the family heritage. And he sat there and said, "Why am I here?" And I tried, as a young pastor, learning to navigate my way into being real and give witness. But frankly, what I was offering up to this man were platitudes, not the truth of my experience at that young age. I hadn't really suffered much. I'd grown up in a mill village, and most of you know that I've told those stories before. And everybody was having sort of the same experience in those mill villages. We chased the fog truck, which was really the mosquito truck. I'm surprised that we don't all have three heads, because we were riding our bicycles behind the thing. We drank water out of the ditch. We played when it was raining and not storming. And we oftentimes would ride in the back window up above the back seat on any long trip. And yes, we drank water straight out of the spigot. And in that experience, though, there was a bubble. I had not been exposed to a lot of the pandemonium that was part of the 60s. I was just a kid in a mill village. It was Jim who was, as he was talking about the eroding values, and I was trying to quote scripture, trying to get him to think about his heritage. Just reminded me in his question, "Harry, who's Jesus to you? Why do you follow somebody who's been dead 2,000 years?" I'd love to be able to say to you that I knew immediately at that moment what I needed to say. But it would take years to craft different answers to that question to the different people who were asking it. Because I can assure you that that question was asked by a man whose son was killed in Iraq and never found. And where was God when my son was killed? And why are you following Jesus? He was asking that same question that a mother whose only daughter was killed in a car accident, or the son that overdosed, or the man when I was police chaplaining in Newberry was sitting in the bathroom with a shotgun under his chin. And I was sitting outside the door, and he was asking why should I live, and does God really care? It was those moments of suffering, I think, that Jesus was inviting his disciples when he asked them, who do you say that I am? He was setting them up for the response that he would give after Jesus' magnificent reveal was made through Peter when he said, you're the Messiah, you're the Son of God, which was a real answer. Just like the real answers that often I've tried to give is a real answer. It's from the heart. Jesus is Lord. Jesus is Savior. He is my Savior. He is the one and all. He is the Redeemer of humankind and my soul. But see, Jesus went on to unpack that and say, anybody who would be my follower must deny self, take up his or her cross, and follow me daily. And I've talked a lot about, over my time here, the difference between belief and trust. Because the word faith in its original means that you are putting your trust in something or someone. And Jesus was wanting to move them to understand that following him was more than just a set of propositions. You see, I think one of the things that we do in church life is that we set up these propositional statements, or these things that you must support. If you're going to be a follower of Jesus, then you have to support this doctrine or this social action piece or this stance on one of the hot social topics, as if it was a litmus test for your ability to follow Jesus. And Jesus is making it more personal. Let me take you to another nightly conversation, one that you have to turn all the way over to the 3rd chapter of John. And we visited this before, but I think it's a verse that is worth revisiting again this morning. Jesus is sought out by the religious leader, member of the Sanhedrin named Nicodemus, and meets him at night. And I've, in my teachings before, talked about that it is that nighttime visit that comes in the cover of darkness that allows him a certain degree of anonymity. But also I think there's an invitation to us to realize that, again, some of the most sacred and wonderful conversations that we ever have are when we're vulnerable, when we're alone, when we are able to stop whatever it is we're doing. I've often heard other pastors say that when people greet them at the door, telling them what a great sermon it is, that it's not the one who greets at the door at the loudest and saying, what a great preacher, great sermon preacher. Not that we don't appreciate that, or I don't appreciate it. I do. But typically it's the person who calls me the next week and said, we need to talk. God's really dealing with me about something that was said Sunday morning. And friends, it was that way for me. When I was growing up in that mill village, I went to church, and I was a part of the United Methodist Church there in McCormick, and I've shared about some of my early memories of that, mostly being my dad scraping his fingernails with a pocket knife that I carried, and the sound of the pastor's voice. But it wasn't until I was 17 years old that I started to really answer that question that Jesus poses to all of us. Who do you say I am? Last week I mentioned that there are 4 dimensions of the way that really come to understand and know him personally. First of that was through study, trying to wrap my mind and head around who he was and how did he stand in history. And even as a 15-year-old, trying to explore and read other wisdom literature. And I was thankful that my parents didn't give too much guff about me buying a Bhagavad Gita, which is a holy text for the Hindu faith, because I wanted to know, was what I grew up with true? Was the person of Jesus truly who he said he was? But the second dimension is that I've discovered and known is through experience. In that experience, it's not just my own personal experience, but my personal experience with others who are sharing their deepest longings, even their deepest questions, like Jim. When I was 17 years old, I was a lifeguard at Baker Creek State Park. And one of the things that being a lifeguard there meant was that we had a lot of downtime, particularly around holidays. You would think it would be quite the opposite, but people would typically shy away. And one particular day, when a friend of mine, one of my best friends, we were at the pavilion with no swimmers in the water, a car came screeching up at the outside of the pavilion with some people jumping out of the car, screaming for help, that there had been an accident at the boat ramp a mile away. And we went and jumped in the car with them, and they drove us to the boat ramp, and there's a large family reunion that was going on. There were people everywhere. And people were standing around, and some were weeping, and others were pointing, and the two young men who had come to get us ran us down to the dock and started pointing at the water, saying, "She went down right there, she went down right there." What had happened is some of these kids had snuck away and had a few little adult beverage pieces, and then they started horseplaying on the dock, and this 14-year-old girl named Pamela Williams was pushed into the water by accident, it seems, but she couldn't swim, and neither could any of the folks with her. None of the adults could even swim. And even in the midst of that moment, in the confusion of the moment, no one had thought or had the presence of mind to throw something to her that floated. Everybody was looking to everybody to do something. So by the time we got there and they pointed where she had gone down, Steve and I drove in and we began our search. Steve found her. We brought her to the surface, and we swam her to the dock. And remember, we're 17 years old. Now, we'd had CPR, such as it was, and I want to challenge anybody who's had CPR and hadn't practiced it later, try to remember it on the fly when the tension's on, and mouth to mouth. And we began to do our work, and McCormick is an oddity of a geographical nature in that there are 3 state parks in that poor county. And this is EMS that was coming from Greenwood, which is 25 miles on the other side of McCormick. And they went to the wrong state park. And then they finally made it. But we had been working on her an hour. And we'd swap. And she would vomit the contents of her mouth in hours, and we'd spit and gag. And we'd keep going. But about a half hour into it, the crowd had gathered. No one offered, and we just kept on going. Closer to the hour mark, the crowd had swollen. And people had started talking that we ought to give up. We could hear the whispers. But then it came. Some good old boy standing to the side, having watched long enough, said, "You boys ought to quit. That end's dead." You know what end I'm talking about, friends? I'd grown up in a bubble. I'd gone through desegregation in 1969, and I had 2 people in my class who were of color. I never thought about what they had to go through. I never gave a second thought about what fear or what they had to go through to make that transition. I just knew Maria and Lenora in my class. I'd heard the N-word growing up from grandparents, uncles, friends. I'd even told jokes. But for the first time in my life, all of the horror and all of the hatred and all of the distance and everything that I'd been taught spiritually and had experienced came to bear on this 14-year-old girl who was lying dead. We were trying to save her and couldn't. And she had been reduced to a name, a label. And friends, something broke in me. And I would love to tell you that day that I became a born-again man. I'd love to tell you that that was the day that I accepted Jesus and that my life was transformed. But I will tell you that that became the moment that my heart was punctured and that my background came into question and that my behavior and also, more importantly, my ability to save and control my own destiny in life, which we as young people, a lot of times we feel like we're bulletproof and immortal, that I have no control over life or hers. It began a journey of experience, of wanting to know this God of creation. You see, when Nicodemus was meeting Jesus, he had a lot of preconceived ideas about who God was and who was supposed to be and who the Messiah was supposed to be. And so many of the times when we are coming to Jesus, we want Jesus to fit who we think he ought to be. E.P. Sanders did a lot of research on Thomas Jefferson. And if you know something about Thomas Jefferson, he had a lot of problems with Jesus being divine. He had a lot of, but he liked Jesus, the ethical teacher. And Thomas Jefferson literally took the Bible and he, with his scissors, cut out the pieces that fit him and fit what he believed Jesus, the authority and the historical Jesus would say. He literally used the Bible for his own purposes, and he cut it up to make his own book of sayings and ethical sayings. And E.P. Sanders and others said, you know, the Jesus that Thomas Jefferson ended up with actually looked a whole lot like Thomas Jefferson. And you know, we do the same thing. When we paint Jesus through the lens of our own experience, when we paint Jesus only through the lens of our own upbringing, I have to applaud Nicodemus who had been stirred by God's Spirit to seek Jesus out and to ask him and to try to encounter Jesus on his own terms. And Jesus responds to him. And listen to this. Jesus gives him this cryptic answer to his questions. Unless a person is born from above. Some translations, or born again, to which Nicodemus' answer seems to correspond to that more nearly. How can a man re-enter his mother's womb? This is the offer of the living Jesus that I have experienced and seen over and over again as men and women have turned to Jesus and say, I'm going to answer who you are by saying, you are my Lord, you are my Savior. And I see a transformation start to take place in those who've been chained in addiction, chained in hatred. A lot of the mission work I've done has been devoted to working in the counties and in the homes of people who are socioeconomically beaten up or low-income families. Time and time again, as people have encountered Jesus, the lives have become whole. I want to just say that when Nicodemus asked his questions in the dark, as I've asked my questions in the dark, that are we willing to then say, I want to follow you? In many ways, my call to ministry is linked to the death of a 14-year-old girl of color. But I mentioned her name, Pamela Williams, in honor of her and her family. I've tried to reach out to them over the years and find out where they were to say, you know, your daughter's death was tragic, and it was horrible loss. And I don't know if this would be any comfort to you at all, but her death began a journey for me with Jesus that I pray has affected lives for eternity. And I would look forward to seeing her again. I pray that tonight, this morning, anytime this afternoon, whenever you are watching this, that you can get alone for a bit and just sit with Jesus like Nicodemus. Sit with Jesus like the guys at the campfire. And truly open your life to the experience and your mind to the experience of what God has done for you. The invitation He makes to you to start over, to be born again, to start anew. That you don't have to be subject to the bonds of your birth. You don't have to be a slave to the bonds of your heritage. He calls us to new life and to new loyalties. In this time of violence, I pray that this is where we as the church really start our identity. That we don't start our identity conversations around liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, but we really start our conversations, hey, who do you say Jesus is? And that we in our commonality, in our heart, in our lives being transparent and being vulnerable to hearing each other's story and hearing each other's testimony will make us stronger and make us understand that we truly are one family. I pray this week we see some miracle breakthroughs of love and loyalty in our nation. Things that often in the media you don't see. The people praying together. The people lifting up their voices in song. The people who are chanting, Waymaker, Miracle Maker. Someone who's a bondage breaker. I don't have any other gospel, my friends. I don't have any other good news than to say that Jesus is Lord. May you be blessed this week. God bless you.
Hey, all of my free-range followers of Jesus in Wadesboro and beyond. We're so glad that you're joining us and journeying with us in this series of Worship in Place. We're so thankful that you are joining us each week, and we also thank you so much for your generosity as you continue to support the ministry of First Baptist. As we are reaching more people than we actually could have worshiping in place, our extension of ministry is reaching other communities, and it's because of your generosity and your support that we're able to continue to offer the Word of Christ, to do mission in our own community. And we want you to know that as you send in your checks to the church or you give securely online, every gift is so appreciated, and we're so thankful that you're continuing to sow the seeds into Christ's ministry. So, on behalf of all of us, thank you, and let's continue to do kingdom work together. God bless you.